Et voilà. Well, that was a great way to start, and with our house rules. So hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde, Ani, welcome to our second presentation in our FishCAST seminar series. And it is my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce for you our speaker, Dr. Stephen Cooke, today. Stephen is going to be giving us a talk, and he hails from Carleton University in Ontario, city of Ottawa, Ontario, where he's a Canada Research Professor in the Department of Biology and also the Institute of Environmental and Interdisciplinary Science. Dr. Cooke is also a founding director of the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation. Dr. Cooke and his lab do cutting-edge and integrative research on fish physiology, behavior, ecology, as well as human dimensions, all with a goal to be able to understand and solve complex environmental problems. Dr. Cooke's research in the domain of fisheries science focuses on sustainable fisheries, and this includes quantifying the consequences of fishing on fish as well as fisheries, and with the goal of developing and promoting strategies that can reduce stress and increase survival. Dr. Cooke has also been involved, even more recently, in efforts to raise the profile of the threats that are facing freshwater fish and freshwater diversity, not just in Canada, but globally as well. And as a consequence, Dr. Cooke's research has contributed to so many aspects of the biology, the conservation, and the management of fish and aquatic ecosystems. And on a personal note, Steve just loves to fish. I think he would proclaim himself to be a fish head. And whether or not it's fishing with his family or fishing with his students, it's all fishing for fun. And fishing for science and fishing for fun, I'd say, would be synonymous for Steve. And when you don't find him out on the lake fishing or snorkeling and tagging his fish, you'll probably find him chowing down on popcorn, one of his favorite foods. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve himself, Dr. Cooke, so that he can present and tell us today all about the interdisciplinarity in fisheries research and management. So please join me in welcoming Steve. Thanks, Steve. Go right ahead.
Thanks so much, Dr. Semeniuk. Tina, really appreciate it. Hi, folks. It's really a pleasure to be able to share some thoughts with you today. We'll spend the next half hour or so together with me telling a tale, and then we'll have some time for questions. Today, I'm joining you from the parking lot of a Canadian Tire, where I'm seeking better internet than is available at my cottage. So that's why I'm in a car. And I'm on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples, where I live, work, and play. So today I'm going to talk about interdisciplinarity. Now, this is a term that is used in every university strategic plan. It's something that we spend a lot of time talking about, but when push comes to shove, I'm not sure that we really understand that term as well as we think, or know how to operationalize that as a concept in a meaningful way. So I've spent a fair amount of time over the last decade or so thinking about interdisciplinarity and what it means broadly. But being a fish head, I'm also interested in what it means in the context of fisheries research and management. So what I'm going to do today is provide sort of a crash course in interdisciplinarity, and then try to make some links between that to fisheries research and management. So let's start off with just a few concepts here. So first of all, you know, a single discipline working on its own, that is a discipline. When we have a variety of disciplines that are maybe working towards a common goal, but doing so independently, that would be this concept of multidisciplinarity that you see there on the left. So that larger circle sort of encompasses the problem, but everybody's working in isolation. Interdisciplinarity in the middle there is where things start to overlap, not necessarily in a perfect way, but there's intersections between these different domains. And then transdisciplinarity is more of a true blended concept where it all comes together, where it's really hard to figure out where one discipline ends and the next begins. In reality, transdisciplinarity is rarely achieved. Oftentimes when we talk about transdisciplinarity, really we're talking about interdisciplinarity. All of these are different forms of what we call multiple disciplinarity, different from multidisciplinarity. But for the purpose of today, I'm going to use the word interdisciplinary. That is the concept that and the space that I find myself working in most often. I think it's probably the most common domain for others. And it's also the word that seems to be used most commonly in referring to this type of work. In terms of a textbook definition, interdisciplinary or interdisciplinarity is the combination of two or more, it could be multiple disciplines into one activity, for example, a research project, or it could be a career, it could be how you approach things. And it's about creating something new by crossing boundaries and both learning and thinking across them. Okay, so that's it for definitions. I promise I'm not going to bury you in definitions. Now, this is not a new concept, even though it's kind of a hot topic today. This actually goes back some time. So first of all, if we go back pre-1800s, scholars were expected to be generalists. Things weren't broken down into the disciplines that we have today. It wasn't really till the 1800s that we started to have this sort of hardening of disciplines, where we had, the chemists and the natural historians and the philosophers starting to break out. By the mid-1900s, say 1950, 1960, interdisciplinarity was again being discussed, but more in the concept of teaching. So how do we teach people to be able to engage in these complex societal issues? Well, they need to know more than just one thing. So if you took a biology degree, you wouldn't take 40 courses that were all biology 1001, 1002, and so on. You would sample from chemistry and maybe even economics and mathematics and so on. This was mainstreamed by the 2000s, by the academy, funding bodies, and so on. But I would argue it's still misunderstood. And if you'd like to read about the history, that's a great book by Julie Klein that I've got there on the screen. Now, when it was being tweeted that this, actually it probably wasn't Twitter, it was probably an email. There was an email blast that went out about the presentation that I was doing today. And Henry Regier emailed me. So Henry Regier is a very well-known scientist. He's an emeritus prof at the University of Toronto, very active in the fisheries world before his retirement. And Henry has not stopped. He certainly has not stopped thinking. And Henry loves to send emails. He's very, very philosophical. I usually have to read them 3 times before I fully get the depth of what he's trying to share with me. He's very sharp. And there are a couple of things he shared with me that I want to share with you. So he reminded me, and I'm quoting here, that he wrote in his thesis in 1958 at Cornell, he wrote his thesis in a way that was not constrained to fit into some ultra-academic notion of a proper discipline. My thesis dealt with all parts of my suggested 5-clustered ecogeny, so ecology, economics, and so on. He also submitted to me that he thought that going back to 1867, Canada's original Federal Fisheries Act was implicitly ecogenic and thus interdisciplinary. So this is one that I'm still kind of scratching my head on, and I haven't had a chance to have a conversation with Henry about this. I read a few of his papers in preparation. There's a good one worth checking out at the bottom there. But I thought this was fascinating to have somebody that was, that's been, 5 or 6, I guess 7 decades now since he started his PhD work, and being able to weigh in on sort of the fact that, hey, this isn't new. This is something I actually was doing and may in fact have even been implicit in our Fisheries Act going back in time. So fascinating. All right. So what I want to start off with is share with you some perspectives on interdisciplinarity. Now, this work arose from a Royal Society of Canada working group that I chaired on interdisciplinarity with other members of the college, so the early career scholars, artists, and scientists. I co-led this activity with Dr. Vivian Nguyen, who is pictured here. We are co-first authors, but I do want to acknowledge there's 57 or 58 other co-authors that you can see up there. There's going to be a bunch of names you don't realize, or sorry, don't recognize. And there's some folks for which it was their first publication, despite being celebrated scholars or artists and so on. And that's because the RSC working group and the college is made up of a really diverse group of people. So my co-authors included a choreographer, a dance choreographer, a brain surgeon, military historian, nuclear physicist, linguist, and so on. And so we had really diverse perspectives when we tackled this. And so what I'm going to share with you is our collective perspective on what interdisciplinarity is, its the challenges, and so on. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to hit on what some of the key take-home messages are, and then associated with each one of these is a word cloud that hits on some of the words that came out when we did content analysis on what all of our members submitted as perspectives. So what are the benefits of interdisciplinarity? Enables growth, a more rich and understanding of complex problems or phenomena, the availability to disseminate work in broader communities of practice in the policy sphere, and of course in academia. It broadens our perspective, and this brings new insight to otherwise narrow topics. It bridges theory, empirical research, and practice, and allows us to learn from our colleagues. And this can lead to more interesting collaborations. And I think a great example is here. And I love collaborating with my fishy friends, but I have to admit, I don't learn as much from them as I learn from my non-fishy colleagues, because they approach things differently. They have different training, and inherently they have a lot more different knowledge to share with me. That's one of the reasons why I really like to engage in interdisciplinary research. Nonetheless, there are a lot of barriers to doing interdisciplinary work. There's a lot of tensions around issues of rigor and currency. So, at what point is one's work considered valid? How do we assess things when we're working in this sort of boundary space? Oftentimes, we are embedded within institutional silos, and our colleagues, our peers, may not know how to assess what we're doing if we're doing things that are perhaps outside of our disciplinary norms. There can be fundamentally different approaches to gathering, analyzing, and interpreting data among disciplines, very different cultures. And it's not easy. It takes time and effort. And that's time and effort that's not being devoted to, what you're doing in the classroom or actually, writing paper. So it takes time to learn a new language, culture, and vocabulary. Oftentimes we're too busy with work to be creative. And when you work across interdisciplinary lines or in interdisciplinary spaces, there's a creative element to that. There must be, and that takes time. It slows things down. And then, of course, funding structures. If every time you pitch a grant out there, somebody looks at it and says, well, this is pretty cool stuff, but, it's got too much natural science. So why don't you try to go to the Social Science Research Council? And you go to the Social Science Research Council and they say, you know what? There's a little bit too much natural science in there. Why don't you go to them for funding? And so there are these challenges with actually obtaining funding. And then even if you do put something forward, the assessment of it, how it's evaluated, is more challenging than something that falls into traditional disciplinary norms. There are risks to engaging in interdisciplinary work as well, and I would submit that these are greatest for those folks that are pre-tenure or pre-employment even. Oftentimes we use assessment standards, whether that's for hiring or for assessing tenure and promotion. And if you don't fit into any of those boxes, it makes it challenging. Your CV may look unfocused. You may be called scattered, especially when you're going up against maybe 100 other folks that are applying for a position. There's the potential to devalue of work by colleagues that fail to embrace interdisciplinarity. So this can be problematic. If you buy into interdisciplinarity so much, do you then start to devalue work that's done in disciplinary silos? And that's not right either. There's potential risk, and this is inherent in all research, but it's probably amplified when trying new things, which is common with interdisciplinarity. A lack of understanding sometimes of the theoretical or conceptual basis that may weaken the results if one doesn't truly understand the foundations of the disciplinary components, and then being forced into interdisciplinarity to secure funding. So maybe you don't want to work in that space, but there is a funding call and you got to try and pigeonhole something outline in there. I've highlighted a direct quote from one of my colleagues here that I really like. There are only risks and drawbacks if you do not value diversity of ideas and perspectives, which I think is a pretty cool quote. There are facilitators to interdisciplinarity. So first of all, creating an appropriate space. I know it's hard to think about the space where we come together these days, as I sit in a car and you sit in your basements, but there will be a time when we're allowed back on campus. And I'm hoping it's actually an opportunity to revisit our space and think about how we can work together in a more meaningful way. Maybe the traditional offices of yesteryear won't be the best place or way to work moving forward. Certain research topics are particularly complex and demand it. I'm going to come back to that. And that really links into the next one. When you've got a problem where you clearly can't tackle it alone, that makes it a really clear signal to funders and peers that this is important, and hopefully they acknowledge it and fund it. Permission to engage. This is a biggie. Having the institutional and peer support to know that when you do this, you will be supported, you will be recognized, you will be rewarded, and you will not be punished. Of course, you have to have an open mind and be a good listener and mutual respect for different norms. And then it also requires the generosity of what I'm calling more senior or established scholars who can help show the way and demonstrate for everybody, especially the early career folks, what's possible. I do acknowledge here that this is somewhat oxymoronic in that the senior or established scholars may in fact not be as embracing interdisciplinarity. It may not have been quite normalized to the extent it is with, I think, the newer cohorts coming through, but nonetheless, we need champions to say, this is all right, you can do this, and we will stick up for you and reward you. As I wrap up this sort of piece in terms of what we learned from our RSC colleagues, there are a couple of key quotes that I want to share here. And I just want to remind everybody, if you could mute, please. I can hear myself coming through somebody's speakers. If you could mute, I would appreciate it. Thank you. So here are a couple of quotes on what interdisciplinarity means to some RSC college members. I'm not going to read them all. You can read them here. I'm gonna read the bottom one, which I think is pretty cool. And this is really why I engage in this sphere. Interdisciplinarity means broadening my intellectual horizons, making me aware of other views and methods, and enabling me to train my students to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Okay, but you can see there's other, scientific imprisonment is used above, the rewards and, being misunderstood. So anyways, really, really neat stuff. All right, so let's start to transition more to the fisheries space. So we're gonna start first of all more broadly with why interdisciplinarity or a multiple disciplinarity approach could have value in conservation science. And this comes from a paper that Vivian and I led during a grad class back in 2016. You can see the title in the paper. It was published in Facets, which is open access, so you can get your hands on it if you want. And we produced this really cool, what I think is a really cool infographic. And there's 5 reasons that we identified as to why we need this approach in conservation science. So the first is that social ecological systems are complex. And if you study fisheries, you are inherently studying social ecological systems. You have that intersection between people and communities and society and the natural resources, the fish, the lakes, the aquatic ecosystems, and the inherent feedbacks and connections between those two. They're very complex. No one individual can do it alone. That links into the second point there. Multiple perspectives are better than one. When I have a problem, the first thing I want to do is consult other people that have good ideas. I want to hear from other people. And this is a great idea to engage in multiple disciplinarity for conservation, which is complex, it's challenging. We need all hands on deck. Another here is the idea that the heterogeneity of the scale necessitates it. This could be spatial scale, could be temporal scale, it could be institutional scale, could be level of biological organization. The point is that it's complex and we need people that can work across scales. Number 4, the idea that conservation involves compromise. And I know this is hard to take, especially for the new early career folks, but it does. Conservation truly is about compromise, and that compromise does not occur in the pages of journals. It happens through conversations. It happens through listening and communicating and having conversations. So and that's something that interdisciplinary enables. And then finally, the results of research must influence practice. So and this is something I've been a frustrated academic for quite some time, and that's because I was doing what I thought I was supposed to do. I was doing research on fish, and I was publishing papers, putting them in the library. And on occasion, I would even email them to end users like policymakers, and it wasn't being used. And so our research must influence practice. And that means understanding these issues more holistically. So just because we know, how a fish population might respond to a regulation, how are the people? How is the community going to respond? What's that going to mean in terms of economics, in terms of livelihoods, nutritional security? It goes on and on and on. And so the more our natural science is more likely to be used if we approach problems from a multiple disciplinary approach, or in what I'm advocating here, an interdisciplinary approach. So let's tell a story here about my first interdisciplinary project. I was fortunate to do a postdoc at the University of British Columbia, working with a large team led by Scott Hinch and Tony Farrell. And I was brought on to help tackle this problem. And I'm showing you a headline from a newspaper. And it's once where the newspaper headline got it right in a very big way. Early salmon migration baffles experts. So we had a bunch of sockeye salmon that were coming back early, and they were dying. They were failing to make it to spawning grounds and reproduce. Just to convince you of that, I'm showing you some data. The green is from 1974 to 1994, and you can see there that the Weaver late-run sockeye salmon tended to migrate between mid-September and mid-October, and mortality rarely exceeded 20%. And then if you look up in the red, those are years 1995 to 2004, you'll see that those fish were coming back early by as much as sometimes 40, 50 days early. And we were seeing mortality rates that approached 100% in some years. Some years it was, I think 96% was the worst for Weaver. So what was causing this, and how could we fix it? So a challenge for sure. The Pacific Salmon Commission dangled money in front of the research community. And so as a responsive research community, we assaulted them with a huge array of proposals, okay? So they got proposals from the marine mammal researchers, from the endocrinologists, the parasitologists, contaminant folks, and so on. The Pacific Salmon Commission was wise. They said, hey folks, we need you to work together. We do not know what the cause is. These are all possible causes. Each of you is asking for the entire budget envelope. We have $1.3 million to give out. We are forcing you to come together in a room and come up with a single project that weaves together all of these components. This was top down, yes, but it needed to happen, and it was brilliant. And I think the science that came from it was really important, and it's changed how a number of us, including my colleague Scott Hinch, does research. We now approach everything from this perspective, ideally not top down, more bottom up, where we work with partners, external partners, to co-produce the research agenda. Then we think about who we need at the table to try and address the problem, and so on. So just wanted to sort of throw this out there. This is how I got into this. If you want to look at sort of the culmination of all of that work, it's presented in Scott Hinch's 2012 paper here. But there's been an evolution. That was early days, and all of those disciplines at the table, those are all scientists, right? Like natural scientists. You have some chemists and oceanographers and biologists and so on, physiologists, but still all natural scientists. Through time, this is, again, our frustration built, and we started to realize that natural science alone was insufficient to influence the policy, the practice, and human behavior. And that's when we started working with Nathan Young and Murray Rudd and a few other folks. Vivian ended up doing her PhD in this space. That's Vivian doing interviews of First Nations fishers in the Lower Fraser River. But we started to ask about how was our science being used or not? Was it being ignored? What do people think of our science? What do rights holders think of our science? What do stakeholders think of our science? What do managers think of our science? And then asking different components of the fisheries sector what they think of things that we're proposing, possible management implications of our work. So we had collaboration with social scientists, political scientists, economists, and indigenous scholars. Sorry, the I should be capitalized there. And in many ways, this took me back to my roots. What I didn't tell you, and what Tina didn't tell you in the introduction, my undergrad is a Bachelor of Environmental Studies. I only got into the sort of more hardcore fish biology, a bit more into the physiology and behavior during my master's and PhD. My undergrad was about sustainability science. It was about human dimensions. It was about policy. And so I found myself sort of coming full circle in my career, where I'm now very grateful for that undergrad because I'm able to use it to increase the impact of the work we're doing. And it allows me to be able to engage in meaningful collaborations with the types of folks that I've got listed here. A few other fisheries science examples that I think are quite interesting. So this idea that it's really been out of necessity, where we've needed diverse perspectives. So the top example here, we do a lot of work on catch and release. And my colleague Robert Arlinghaus, who is an amazing interdisciplinary scholar in Germany, assembled a team because we wanted to look at catch and release from a historical, ethical, social, and biological perspective. We look at bycatch mortality of endangered coho in British Columbia, where we looked at impacts, solutions, and perspectives of the First Nations individuals. And I will point out, this is a classic example of where the peer review community failed us. This paper got beat up. Everybody wanted us to rip it apart, put the biology in one paper and put the human dimensions components in another. Fortunately, the editors were brave enough to let us go down this path, but that is the kind of challenge that you face doing this kind of work. And then the final example in the bottom there is fish passage science. And this isn't about bringing in social science, but more so the engineers and the hydrologists and the fishery scientists working together. So I want to move on now to some tips. And these tips emerge from a paper that I was involved with that was led by Rachel Kelly. She's pictured there, Dr. Rachel Kelly now. She's a postdoc at the University of Tasmania, and she does fantastic work on in the social ecological research sphere. And if you look at the names on that paper, you should recognize a few from the fisheries community. Greta Peckel does a lot of fish climate change work. Rob Stevenson is a DFO scientist from the East Coast, and there's a bunch more. Eddie Allison, they're almost all folks that have a bit of a fishy flair to them, not quite all. And we came together and basically, in a virtual sense, and brainstormed on tips. And so what I'm going to share with you today are our tips for those that are developing as interdisciplinary social ecological researchers. So really directed, the first 8 are directed towards early career folks, and the last 2 more towards leaders. So the first tip here is develop an area of expertise, a core grounding, that shapes your identity so you can contribute and engage in these collaborations. And so here's something that you may have seen before. I've modified this and brought in some ideas from a few different folks. So normally we operate as specialists, right? So we're sort of like an I model, if you will, where we've got great depth of knowledge, but not much breadth of skill. Then we've got generalists. So that's more like that bar across the top there, where we've got people that are broad in terms of their understanding, but they don't have depth of knowledge. For a long time, we thought about the importance of training students in what we call the T model. So where you're a generalist, but you have one specialty. And so we thought that was how we train interdisciplinarians. And then somebody said, well, you know what? We should do a pie model. So the pie model is better. So the one with the 2 specialties coming off the bottom, that ended up sort of being, what we strived for. Then somebody said, hey, you know what? We should call this a comb model and have multiple disciplines that students have to know. And then we started to think about it and say, but that's a lot. How can somebody know all so many specialties with that much depth? And so that's led to this this next model, which we call the SHIELD model, and where it recognizes that you have a variety of specialties, but you don't necessarily have equal depth in all of those specialties. And then, of course, you have that generalist perspective that connects them across the top. You can decide what you want to be. I think I probably fall into that comb model. I know a lot of my colleagues that are involved with FishCAST do as well. But it helps to think about this and frame what you want to be and helps you determine how to get there. The next tip, tip 2, learn and embrace new languages and cultures. I've said this already. There are books on this topic. If this was easy, we would not need the Oxford Handbook of Interdisciplinarity, okay? It's about finding common languages, about being respectful, about being a good listener. Number 3, being open-minded. Again, it links in many ways to the previous comment. You got to be open to learning and new ways of doing things that might be paradigm changing in how you approach questions. And as long as you're up for it, you will learn a lot. Could be transformational. Tip 4, be patient. It takes time, and you will learn from your failures. You just have to take time to learn from your failures. You have to be reflective. So something to think about. Embracing complexity. It's going to be challenging. Make sure that your collaborations involve diverse team members so you can learn from them, and recognize that every researcher can make a valid contribution. You just need to provide opportunities for everybody to do so. Tip number 6, collaborate widely. I really like this. Ditch your ego, and realize there's a whole lot you don't know, and be prepared to learn. Collaborative approaches demand the ability to work and get along with others. There's some people that I do not collaborate with because they are they're not good collaborators. They're not fun to work with. I don't learn from it. It's not productive in quotes. So you get to choose who you collaborate with by and large. So choose wisely. Push your boundaries. This one's a big one for me. Make attempts, big or small, to get out of your comfort zone. Expose yourself to new perspectives. I just want to share a few examples here where I've done this in my career and found it to be extremely useful. I do a lot of work in both the inland and the marine sphere, and that might not sound like it's earth-shattering in any way, but it's actually remarkably uncommon. So we have different journals where we publish marine work and freshwater work. We go to different conferences. We belong to different societies. We get trained at different institutions. Okay, there are exceptions here, but this is an issue that I think is problematic. And so here we wrote about where the waters meet, sharing ideas and experiences between and across those realms. Another great example is the recreational and the commercial fishing sectors that are often thought of as being entirely different. Yet when you sit down and reflect on them and dig in, there's a lot of common issues, a lot of opportunity to learn from each other and work collaboratively on common problems. And then the final example here is more in terms of sort of institutional and disciplinary. Jesse Vermeer and I reflected on our experience working both in the environmental studies and environmental science domain. And in this paper, we argue that it really is blurry, as it should be, between these two realms, and that you should be able to work anywhere along the entirety of that spectrum, depending on the topic of the day and the issue of the day. The final one, and this is the one that I'm particularly proud of, is the idea of conservation physiology. This was a merging of ideas worked on initially with Martin Wikelski and have followed up on with a much bigger and more diverse group of folks. We now have a journal called Conservation Physiology. Christine Madliger, Craig Franklin, Oliver Love, and I recently wrote a textbook and with lots of edited contributions from a bunch of folks from around the world on conservation physiology. This would not have been possible if I wasn't thinking and reading across disciplinary lines and thinking about where things came together. It was uncomfortable, it was challenging, but I think the payoff has been huge. Tip number 8, consider if you will engage in interdisciplinary research. You do not have to. Okay, nobody's forcing you, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with just saying, you know what, I love this enzyme and I'm going to spend my life figuring out what it does and how it works, and it's just me and that enzyme. That is absolutely fine. You need to decide, if you want to go down this path, though, it is open to you, and there are ways, and there's a community there willing to support you. The next tip is for institutions and leaders, and so fostering an interdisciplinary culture, giving others the freedom to work and think. And again, it's about, creating a space for folks to be creative and engage in this kind of work. And then champion interdisciplinary researchers. Great interdisciplinary researchers deserve recognition, just like we give recognition to those that work in single disciplines. And I think a really great example is this photo. So you should recognize Daniel Pauly on the left, arguably the most famous fisheries scientist on the planet. He is receiving the Dawson Medal for Excellence in Interdisciplinary Research from the Royal Society of Canada. That's Chad Gaffield, the then president. This is back in 2017, providing that award. So there's a fisheries scientist who all of you know, engages in a lot of interdisciplinary work, being rewarded for that work. So I'm near the end of my time here. Some take-home messages. So first of all, working at interfaces and across boundaries is rewarding, but it is not easy. You will hit some barriers. You will have to jump or dig under or skirt around those. You need to be a good listener and have a willingness to learn. It will be a humbling experience. Look for the commonalities between fields that are superficially different. There's a lot more similarity than you think when you dig in and have those informal conversations with colleagues. Interdisciplinary collaboration is stimulating and fun, or it should be. If it isn't, find different collaborators. We need to do a better job of valuing all forms of scholarly activity and knowledge generation activities and paradigms and ways of knowing. And I think here I just want to note that, when I think about interdisciplinarity, and I think most people do, they think about it in disciplines in an academic sense. But I think we also need to be thinking about other ways of knowing, for example, Indigenous knowledge, and stakeholder knowledge, and how it interfaces as well, and recognize that those are also knowledge domains that are worthy of inclusion and worthy of recognition as being part of what it means for interdisciplinarity. So I look forward to talking about that. That's, I haven't found anything good to read specifically on that topic. And then why do I work in this space? I really love learning, and complex environmental problems demand it. And I think when just going back and reflecting on, on the why, most fisheries issues are complex. They're wicked problems in most instances. And we need solutions. We need win-win solutions that, that are good for fish and good for biodiversity, but also good for communities and the economy and hungry people, that span the gamut. We need solutions. So find a problem. I'm preaching now to the early career folks. Find a problem and build a diverse team and solve it. And if you don't know where to go looking for problems, here's a few just to get you going. Go to the Sustainable Development Goals. There's lots been written about how not just Goal 14, life below water, but how fisheries issues intersect with a lot of the SDGs. The WWF report on the world's forgotten fishes, freshwater fish, just came out. Lots of sad stories in there that you can devote your attention to. And I just wanted to pick a few issues that are closer to home. Goldfish in Toronto Harbor. That's not just a biological issue. Who's releasing these things? Why? What can we do to change human behavior so that doesn't happen? And then, of course, we've got the lobster, I'll call it a crisis, where we've got conflict between different communities, in particular between Indigenous communities and some other commercial fishers. There's a lot of fascinating and complex scholarship to be done around topics such as governance, treaty rights, ethics, and of course biology. So some fascinating things to be done, and we need your help. We have failed you, the established researchers. We have failed our world. We are not addressing these issues. So it's up to you. And I think equipping yourselves in a way to be able to embrace interdisciplinary approaches will serve you well. A reminder, next month, please join us again. We will hear from Dr. Kat Febria, a professor at the University of Windsor, who's going to be talking about centering communities in freshwater restoration science. That's Friday, the 25th of June, the same time, noon Eastern Standard Time. And there's the links to register for that. And with that, I'll leave you to check out this. This is my last slide, something from PhD Comics, which I think does a nice job of summarizing the way that I think most of us perceive interdisciplinarity when we try to do it within our own institutions. So just emphasizing that there's still a lot of work that we need to do here. So with that, thank you very much.
That was great, Steve. Thanks so much. And you're getting a bunch of applauses. I don't know if you can see it from your screen, but thanks everyone for joining me and thanking Steve for his talk. Well, why don't we then now open the floor to questions? Please feel free to use the chat box.